I mean, you could be outside in this beautiful afternoon. So you'll have to decide later whether you made the right choice. But thank you. First, I want to thank Catherine Bayliss for teeing up the passages from the Gloucesterman books that was the raw material for this talk. Now, I must confess that I have not read every word of all 4 of the Gloucesterman books, but I think I have read all the passages about the harbor. And second, while I'm in a confessional mode, I wrote the description that you may have read on the website before I had finished writing my talk. So I want to tell you that in its current form, my presentation has 3 parts. First, a short section on references to Gloucester Harbor in Prologos, the first of the Gloucesterman books. A second, very short nonfiction section on Jonathan Bayliss's view of the harbor. And third, and the longest section, illustrates many of the ways Bayliss uses the harbor throughout his works. And I'm going to do that by focusing on one chapter in particular from Gloucester book. Now, as you know, Bayliss gives everything in his books his own idiosyncratic names. For example, he calls Cape Ann Cape Gloucester, and he calls Gloucester Dogtown. But for simplicity and clarity in this oral presentation, I will reference places by their current names for the most part. Gloucester Harbor in Prologos. Jonathan Bayliss left Harvard in 1943 to join the Navy, to serve his country during World War II, as did so many of his contemporaries. Perhaps it was his time in the Navy that stimulated his interest in harbors. In Prologos, the first of the Gloucesterman tetralogy, he mentions the Embarcadero beside San Francisco's harbor, the Tanapag Harbor in the Mariana Islands, Monterey Harbor, Guam Harbor, Boston Harbor, and several other harbors. And even though Prologos centers on the character Michael Chapman during his life in California, Chapman, in the story, had previously spent time in Gloucester, and Prologos contains at least 4 substantial passages describing Gloucester Harbor. Here is just one of those extended passages, one of a dozen that I might quote throughout the 4 books to illustrate several aspects of Bayliss's treatment of the harbor. Listen for 3 motifs in this passage that appear again and again throughout his work in connection with the harbor. First, the harbor of Gloucester's past, illustrating Bayliss's historical habit of mind. Second, the gritty realism of the lives of those involved in fishing who live close to the harbor. And third, the sense of Gloucester Harbor in decline. Now, in this passage, Michael Chapman fantasizes about bringing the current object of his affections to Gloucester and to live here with her. Someday, I'll buy the stone jug built as Fitzhugh Lane's studio and set her up right there on Gloucester's Merry Mount, where the end of the Revolution was celebrated under a great blasted oak on solitary and vulnerable, 23 feet in girth, all lighted up with torches and rum. Where there's never been an Anglican dance on May Day or a pine tree decked with rainbow streamers and fragrant garlands. Now, a residentially undesirable neighborhood that we could afford to live in, among the wooden-dwelling inner harbor populace, encircled by what might be left of the maritime railways, nautical machine shops, chandleries, coal and lumber yards, and fish packers, strung along between the decaying wharfs and sheds of the waterfront, with the power plant, a sail loft, the ruins of gasworks, a paint factory, and the police station looped around all that might be left of the old bars and boarding houses used in the city's high old times by visiting sailors, fishermen, and whores. Let me just add a special note. If you either tomorrow morning or at some other time see the Blatchford exhibit at the Cape Ann Museum Green, you get a wonderful sense, partly from the pictures, but also from two of the maps that show the things that Bayliss just sort of described as surrounding Fitzhenry Lane's house before it was turned into the park. So in Bayliss's work, the depiction of the fishing industry in decline often leads to a repeated, seems to me almost obsessive, apprehension about what might become of Gloucester and its harbor in the future. It seems almost a dystopian vision, often including the twin horrors of tourism and urban renewal. What I called above the gritty realism is related to the way the harbor and mention of the harbor is used as a socioeconomic marker that distinguishes the status of those who work the fisheries and live close to the harbor from the codfish aristocracy who live on the brow of an escarpment overlooking the boulevard, higher up and at a distance from the inner harbor. One of the most charming episodes in Prologos recounts the young Michael Chapman, at that point growing up in Cambridge, making a model boat that he sails on the Charles River. He is observed by a Harvard student who takes Michael to Lowell House, where Michael learns that the aristocratic Harvardian is a yachtsman and knows Gloucester and found it agreeable. Michael Chapman observes, quote, "He made no remark about the dirty harbor or the stink, and did not complain about the overpopulation of gulls and dogs, because he knew only the course that took sea tourists right past the entrance to the inner harbor and round to Annisquam, or perhaps the land route from the yacht club at the breakwater to neighboring houses along the back shore. And even if he motored inside to the smelly, picturesque waterfront of Beauport's actual port, he wouldn't have seen where all the people live." Next, Bayliss and urban renewal. In his own voice, Bayliss took issue with urban renewal and the proposed development on the harbor. In 1986, he wrote to the editors of the Gloucester Daily Times to oppose the Harbor Cove development on the 14C2 parcel that even after 40 years is still undeveloped, merely a parking lot. His view is clear, quote, "We have a priceless harbor. There is nothing like it between Boston and Portland. The length of the waterfront is forever limited. If it's valuable to speculators now, in the course of time it will grow far more valuable to whoever owns it. For centuries, Gloucester has survived many depressions better than most places because its economy has been based upon the production of food and other commodities of some importance to the world." So that's a pretty straightforward view, apparently, of what Bayliss thought. And much of that shows up in other parts of his writing. And now, third and longest part, the harbor in the Gloucester books. After Prologos, the three other book-length parts of Gloucesterman, Gloucester Book, Gloucester Tide, Gloucester Mass, take place all over Cape Ann, but primarily in Gloucester. So unsurprisingly, references to the harbor abound in Bayliss's work, if only as a location or point of reference. But there are other ways that the harbor appears or is used in these works as well. As it happens, chapter 4 in Gloucester Book is called The Harbor. Despite the title, however, the chapter is not an exhaustive, focused discussion of the harbor. Nonetheless, it illustrates several additional ways the harbor often appears in Bayliss's works. First, all the action takes place in sight of the harbor, or at least within a stone's throw of the harbor. The soul of Cape Ann, as our conference title suggests, the center of her constituency, quoting Bayliss himself. Now, if you've read that chapter, you may remember that the central activity of the chapter is a tutorial of a newcomer to Gloucester, a young entrepreneur who is here on business, Rafe Opsimath. While he's here, he wants to visit his old teacher from White Quarry College, Doc Epicimus Charlemagne. And you may know that Charlemagne is a character based largely on Charles Olson. Now, Rafe seeks out Doc at his apartment to take him out to dinner, sort of late in the day. They have a long conversation in several parts. First, since Charlemagne has just finished breakfast, they talk in his apartment on Leviathan Court until he is hungry for his next meal. They continue to talk on their walk through town, and they finish the conversation at a restaurant. So the harbor here is not simply a location, but it's associated with a significant episode. Here, the tutorial. And in other works, other significant episodes are associated with the harbor. For example, in Gloucester Tide, Caleb Carcist and his current flame Lillian have a sexual encounter at the paint factory. In Gloucestermas, Arthur Haimboyd recalls a long-ago picnic in Stagefort Park with his then-love, Myra. Also in Gloucestermas, Caleb and Finn McDane share a drink and their growing friendship at Finn's penthouse apartment with a view of the harbor. So in addition to being a simple location and being associated with significant episodes, the harbor itself is often the object of sustained observation and discussion. For example, in this chapter alone, as Rafe seeks out Charlemagne's apartment, he walks up Leviathan Court and, catching his breath, turns back towards the harbor, and the narrator describes what he sees and his reaction to it. When he looked over the rooftops that delineated the inner waters, a segment of the nearly circumferential seaplain was visible beyond the broad, breakwatered valley of the greater harbor. It emanated a peculiar luminosity that terrestrial rotation didn't seem to account for. With no white afloat in the sky to draw attention to its background, the pellucid atmosphere purified his previous distal impression of the panorama he now explored, without denying the broken glass and waste of packaging that were profusely strewn upon the paven ravine. There are numerous such purple patches throughout Bayliss's work, rhapsodizing about the central feature of Gloucester, the harbor. And there are 4 such sustained descriptions in this chapter alone. This one I read, one by Charlemagne at the outset of their walk, another by the narrator describing the harbor at night with its lights and other nocturnal landmarks viewed from the windows of the Windmill restaurant, and a final one by Rafe himself that takes 4 paragraphs and more than a page of text. Charlemagne holds forth on numerous topics in their tutorial, what Rafe comes to call his historical entertainment. These include Doc's neighbors, Rafe's company, Rafe's logbook, which he is keeping at Doc's direction, Kennedy, FDR, and democratic politics, law and religion, Shelley and Edie Schlossberg, who run the van, the hotel where Rafe is staying, Gloucester driving habits and the absence of traffic lights, Yeats and Doc's play about FDR, Meriwether Stern, Dogtown's or Gloucester's Athenaeum, and the Scientific. They cover a lot of ground. Not surprisingly, Doc also expounds upon a number of harbor-related topics. The Suriname trade, Gloucester's experience with whaling, the manufacture of foul weather gear, civic instauration, that is, urban renewal that's going to wipe out the waterfront. These topics and many other harbor-related topics appear throughout Bayliss's works. Here, Doc is especially irked by the phrase, the needle trade. He scornfully describes how a sail-mending needle has been given a new meaning associated with modern pleasure boats and tourism. Quote, All the old livelihoods from or for the schooners used to be called the needle trades, after sailmaking, the elite art. Not just carpenters, coopers, smiths, and all other artificers, but also the chandlers, the victuallers, and providers of shore comforts. But nowadays, needle trades is our mockery of all that. Most recently, the Pilgrim Division, that is the tourist division, of the Chamber of Commerce ignorantly adopted it as a solemn term for the yacht and tourist business. When Charlemagne is ready to eat again, having imbibed most of the 2 bottles of whiskey that Rafe has brought to share, the two set out on their walk to a late dinner along the old shore route along the harbor, from near the head of the harbor, near the beginning of East Main Street, to Main Street, through downtown to the West End, then to the boulevard, and they end up at the Windmill Restaurant, and where the tavern is now, named and placed there in tribute to a windmill that stood at that spot since before the 1840s, when it was taken down, when the Pavilion Hotel was established there. Doc starts by taking Rafe to the dilapidated Whale Wharf at what Doc calls the crouch of the harbor, where Doc disposes of his garbage by dropping a bag through a hole in the wharf. Gesturing counterclockwise around the view of the harbor from there, Doc provides his own panoramic description, Doc's version of many such vistas in J.B.'s works, as I have mentioned. Along the way, the narrator calls out street names and stores often using invented or historical names. Front Street, Federal Hill, Morality Square, Pleasure Street, Back Street. Now, these may be recognizable for those of you in the know about the geography of downtown Gloucester, or if you knew about it in the 60s, the apparent time of the events of this chapter. Along Front Street in particular, the spine of the town, the narrative identifies almost every building along the way. City Lights Theater, liquor stores, bars, Pound drugstore, where Doc buys that day's Dogtown Daily Noose, Yuleworth chain store, 2 bank buildings, another picture theater, a stretch of priceless architecture, early 19th century gabled brick or granite, which had first-floor businesses, barbers, cobblers, a locksmithy, more than one Tuscan bakery, a second-hand furniture store, with apartments above. This walk, a block from the edge of the harbor, is reminiscent of similar harborside walks taken by characters in all books of Bayliss. Earlier in Gloucester book, Rafe walks from the West End to the boulevard across the cut and up to Stageport Park. You may remember that Theo read that passage last night if you were here. And in Gloucester, Mass., Caleb is described several times traversing the inner harbor, noting its features along the way en route to his studio apartment on Rocky Neck. These walks along the harbor are structuring devices to move the action forward, but their detailed lists of streets traveled and crossed, buildings passed, and sights seen memorialize these things through these enumerations and catalogs, and have the effect of mapping out the scene in its entirety, in this case the harbor, far beyond the requirements of the storyline. They become an end in themselves to memorialize the harbor and its shoreline of the past. When they arrive at the windmill just before closing time, in the story it seems that Doc Charlemagne was often the last customer at the restaurant in any given night. Doc insists that they be, quote, led to one of the tables least convenient to the kitchen, where he could occupy his favorite vantage at the great plate glass windows from which he could look out at the harbor. Doc instructs the waitress, quote, Pull back those drapes all the way, will you, dearie, so I can show this stranger our harbor. And the reader, now from the windmill, gets another description of the harbor beginning, the divacorate gulf of Dogtown's night-sprawled loins was sparsely punctuated with an ensemble of dissonant lights. And the variety of lights are described in great detail as to their location and purpose for a long paragraph. So this introduces another characteristic harbor-related motif in Bayliss's works. So many characters are interested in the various views of the harbor from different perspectives. Gloucester Mass, the final book of the tetralogy, seems especially notable for the various, almost competing views of the harbor. Whose apartment or studio or office window has the best vantage point of the harbor? We are told that Finn McDane's downtown penthouse apartment has a better view than Caleb's studio on Rocky Neck. Later in Gloucestermas, Arthur Hamboyd and Finn McDade trade Finn's penthouse view of the harbor for one from the Windmill restaurant. We are told that Tessa's house has a magnificent view of the outer harbor. Tessa's house is across the cut and higher up. She can see the lighthouse and the breakwater in the outer harbor, in contrast to Caleb's view, which has its virtues for its view of the inner harbor. Caleb and Finn watch the schooner race and the larger seascape from Faye's house. In Gloucester Book, we're told of the view from city planner Dexter Keith's office, and also from the view from Governor's Hill. And back in Gloucestermas, we are told the world's best view of the inner harbor is from Espiritu Santo Hill, which is more or less Our Lady of Good Voyage. So sometimes, as readers of Bayliss knows, Bayliss finds a way or goes out of his way to reference the harbor. Of course, as readers of Bayliss know, Bayliss finds a way or goes out of his way and to some lengths to bring in reference to all kinds of things as it suits his fancy throughout his books. But in the chapter called The Harbor, it is the harbor that evinces this habit of mind. The chapter moves to a close with Doc's commentary on the obituary of Prospero Ozone, based in part on John Hayes Hammond Jr., who, we are reminded, tested out his remote control technology on the harbor. And the chapter ends with a reference to one of the harbor's most elusive alleged inhabitants, or at least a newsworthy visitor, the sea serpent, that in the book gives the name to Serpentine Avenue, to what we know as the Boulevard. So this has been a quick romp through a variety of references that Bayliss uses to different effects in different parts of his books. As you heard, references to and associations with the harbor appear from time to time almost inevitably in books that take as their primary location the country's oldest continuously operating seaport with its beautiful harbor, Le Beau Port. But in Bayliss's works, besides being a simple location, the harbor is also associated with significant episodes, is the object of repeated extended description, is the subject around which there is competition. Who has the best view of the harbor? And it is also a topic discussed at length in its own right, what it was, what it is, and what it might become. Thank you.